This webinar will cover the 4 essential pain facts and how modern pain neuroscience underpins and predicts recovery from persisting pain. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways from which we are all zooming in from today. We recognise their diversity, resilience, and the ongoing place that First Peoples hold in our communities. We pay our respects for the elders, both past and present, and I wish to extend that respect to any First Nations people connecting in today. We commit to working together in the spirit of mutual understanding, respect, and reconciliation. We support self-determination for First Nations peoples and organisations, and will work together on closing the gap. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The majority of our webinars are recorded and freely available on our PHN Learn YouTube channel. Jade has that link up on the screen at the moment. I have our upcoming events on the screen. You can register for these via our website, and that link will also be on the in the chat for you, actually. Please make note of the Westvic PHN health pathways relating to this topic that is on the screen at the moment. And for this evening's webinar, all participants will remain on mute. If you have questions, please type them in the question and answer box, not the chat box, and I will ask them on your behalf to the presenter during question and answer time. All questions in the question and answer box are anonymous. We do know that for some reason the software does block the question and answer function for attendees dialing in from mobile devices. If you have a question but don't have access to the question and answer box, then please type it into the chat box. However, please be mindful that this will not be anonymous, and please be always respectful of the other attendees and presenters, refraining from negative comments, please. There is a link in the chat box to complete the survey after this evening's webinar. Our speaker for this evening is Mr. Grant McKechnie, accredited exercise physiologist and local pain educator, and Ballarat and surrounds local pain collective facilitator. I will now hand over to Grant to begin. Thanks, Grant.
Hi everyone, and thank you for coming along. So I'm just going to first share my screen. And it's a bit interesting for me because it's a little bit different to the platform that I use, but today we're going to be talking through the modern pain story, or contemporary neuroscience. What we're going to be exploring today is a couple of different things or different ideas about, one, where the pain revolution came from, and then also going through what we call the essential pain facts. And by the end of this, you'll be able to see that things like the sort of bioplasticity, which we'll be talking about through this, actually help predict recovery. So first thing first, I'm going to first acknowledge where I'm sitting. And I'm sitting in Ballarat, which is on the Wadawurrung people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I really, really do have an affinity, not just to the lands around here, but the waterways, because I'm also a rowing coach and I love going out in Lake Windermere, and also even down to Geelong as well, where I love coaching, well, all my spare time. But tonight we're going to get into sort of some of the details, but first we'd like to keep everything transparent. So initially I did receive a scholarship from the Pain Revolution, which is supported also by the University of South Australia. I also work in the pain field, so my business is situated in Ballarat, and my primary group of people that I work with is actually people with pain or persisting pain. And I've also just received a job offer from the Pain Revolution to also help develop and curriculum and presentations. So there's some objectives which were in the PHN link initially, which is sort of to understand and appreciate sort of the complexities of pain, and that pain is actually influenced by many factors, which we'll get through. Discuss the terms of things like bioplasticity and how it's an extension of other things like neuroplasticity. Appreciate the understanding of recovery from persisting pain is not just plausible, actually predictable. And of course, get involved. I'd like you to think about or consider getting involved in a local pain collective. They're soon going to be renamed, hopefully, the local pain circles in your area, and there are local pain educators from the Pain Revolution all through Western Victoria, and they're creating collectives and discussing and exploring these points that I'm going to go through tonight, even in more detail, where you can sort of relate it to cases and explore these concepts further. So a couple of more simple objectives is understand the what and why of what the pain revolution is all about and present the essential pain facts. But the big thing, the absolutely essential thing, is to start a better conversation with your patients, with colleagues, with people around you, even the community associated with this whole idea of persisting pain. So before we get right into it, and I've got a few little things, and you've got emoji capabilities, I believe, that you might be able to put your hands up for certain little activities through this. We've got symbols to help you get involved. So hands up, at certain points, you'll see that emoji, it means we're going to do a hands up thing. We might have speak or say something out loud or say it with me. You don't have to unmute or anything like that. I know you can't, so just speak it with me or read it with me. A couple of slides, you might have to think a little bit more. And some slides will take a little bit of effort because this can be challenging because it goes, well, not against, but it actually sort of progresses on from a lot of things we previously understood because the science is really moving on and it's moving on rapidly. So we need to embrace it, embrace the change. So it can be challenging when it goes against things we've learned in the past. Occasionally you might want to write some things down, and I've got a few slides with that little symbol as well. So they're different slides just to get you involved in interacting. What you also need before you start is, number one, an open mind. Okay, if you've got a chance, some pens, some papers, stuff to just jot things down as we go through. Only a couple of slides might be really, really worthwhile. And I'll have that little write down symbol as we go along. And effort. Be involved. Start thinking about things. I'm going to ask you lots of questions through this. I'm going to try and challenge you and get you thinking about different things. So, firstly, who are we? Who is the Pain Revolution? So, Pain Revolution is a charity that was set up by Lorimer Moseley and some other key people. So it's made up of researchers, it's made up of clinicians, people with lived experiences and people that have recovered from persisting pain, industry partners, and also peak bodies as well. So they're all coming together to tackle this issue that we're seeing more and more and more of persisting pain. The vision of Pain Revolution, and I'm going to just be silent for a second. I want you to read through this. Just take your time and just read through it. So I'll give you a few seconds. Cool. So I'm going to read it with you. I want you to read along with me this time so that all Australians have the knowledge, skills, and support to prevent and overcome persistent pain locally, so in your local areas. And that's one of the big visions of Pain Revolution. That's why we have local pain educators and local pain collectives to start this real process. So here's just a little animation or comic that I drew a while ago. And so effectively what Pain Revolution does is represented in this picture where you've got researchers really starting to find some gold nuggets, especially in the last 10 years. And we're trying to get that modern pain story of these gold nuggets out to the community, out to the people, and try and get them to understand these really key points. So that's a really simple summary of what Pain Revolution is all about. So we're going to talk about 4 key concepts or 4 essential pain facts. Now, how did we get to these key concepts? Well, it started with different research. So Lee did a wonderful paper where it studied over 800 people, and this is continuing on. So I think they're over 1,600 now. But what they actually did was when they put a whole group through pain education, and they found that the people that actually really took on that modern view of pain. So when they actually had a deep conceptual shift relative to how they understood pain, that actually was reflective, or it was matched with how they started to recover. So the people that actually adopted this modern view actually saw improvements overall. Whereas people that didn't adopt that modern view of pain had no change in their symptoms over the 12-month period. So it's really, really important that if we can get that conceptual shift, then we're well on the way to helping recovery. So education helps us do this. And if we look at this fantastic picture from Mosley and Butler, what we're basically looking at is different ways of education. Some people, when we tackle this problem of persisting pain, will be on one side where it's basically they say you get stuff with no, it's not about that, and other people have radical shifts. But what we're really, really aiming for long term with everyone is if we can get this deep conceptual shift. Because if we understand that modern view of pain, if we understand how pain works as we best know currently, then the changes, the re-engagement in activity and how we can get people to move on is actually amazing. So that's the whole way education can really start that whole process and help us with recovery. So when they went through all these studies, they started to ask the experts. The experts were recovered people in those studies. And they asked them, what did they learn that was most important for their recovery? And what they found was they came up with those ideas and took 11 years, and there was a lot of people. So 350 recovered consumers, with 36 scientists, different clinicians, with 6 different scientific disciplines, 7 different clinical disciplines, and then went back to the general public, and we came up with this content and strategy. The content and strategy created 9 learning modules. Now, these 9 learning modules have been a real staple over the last few years, but as you can imagine, 9 learning modules is quite a lot. So what we're going to do is these 9 modules were really key. So the pain is always real. These are the 9 modules. We had learn more about your pain. Pain doesn't equal tissue damage. Pain equals protection. Pain depends on context. Pain and your protectometer. Your overprotective pain system. Retrain your pain system. And be proactive about your pain. So these key learning modules were the basis for the pain revolution going forward. But as you can imagine, to a consumer, that's a lot. That's a lot to try and actually grasp, and sometimes frightening because there's a lot of concepts there. So they took them to a advertising and marketing firm, and the advertising and marketing firm said straight away, it's too many. We need to make it more palatable for the consumer. So that then led to the essential pain facts, to which there are 4 of them. And there they are. So we took the 9 key learning areas and we truncated them down to these pain. So number 1, pain protects us and promotes healing. Persistent pain overprotects us and prevents recovery. Many factors influence pain. There are many ways to reduce pain and gradually recover. So these are the more recent ones. Now, some people, as I said, the essential pain facts. When the marketing firm came up with a name for it as well, they took it to the consumers, and the consumers resoundingly said that was the name that resonated with them the best. Cool. So why is it important to change how we go about this persistent pain issue that is becoming more and more widespread? Well, if you look at some of the statistics, so the statistics over the last couple of decades are increasing. So in 2007, there was about $34.3 billion associated with pain in Australia. So it's about $11,000 per person. But when you actually extrapolate that out, that's over 3 million people, just over 3 million people. In 2018, it was actually $139 billion. It's increasing in 2020, and it's predicted to actually grow well over $215 billion by 2050. So that's only just one statistic. So it's actually a very, very, very big issue. And at the moment, it's creeping up closer to 4 billion. So it's 3.6, 3.7 billion, whereas in 2007, it was about 3.1 billion. 3.1 million people, I should say, not billion people with pain in Australia. Other statistics that we may or may not be aware of is that 56% of people have restricted activities that have chronic pain. 45% of people experience depression. 53.8% of people experiencing chronic pain are female and 46.2% are male. 1 in 3 people over 65 in Australia are living in chronic pain. So a third of the population. But this is the one that struck me the most, this next one. 25 to 35% of children and adolescents experience chronic pain. So we need to change our approach. We need to start to adopt a more modern view of how pain works. So let's get started. Let's get into it. So first idea, time to think a little bit. Hands up, so you can use hopefully your little emoji things. Hands up if you've never had pain. So it's an interesting question because I don't think I've ever met anyone in my life that's never experienced some form of pain, even if it's just stubbing your toe. Now here's another question. So again, another little hands up one if you've got little emojis. Hands up, okay, if you had pain that wasn't real. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? I'm experiencing it, so how can it not be real? And yet some people have been told that the pain's not real. But if you're experiencing it, therefore it is real. So we'll cover these ideas as we go along, and you'll see how it's a lot more complex than what oh, sorry, there's a thing just moved in my room. A lot more complex than what we used to think. So let's get into the essential pain facts. So here's number 1. Pain protects us and promotes healing. Okay, so pain protects us and promotes healing. It's almost 2 really, but we'll cover each area as we go through it. So the old view of the way we used to look at pains was that pain detects some form of tissue damage. Okay, so pain detects tissue damage. Whereas the modern view is that pain protects us and promotes healing, which we just said. So let's break it down. So let's look at how you think pain works. Now let's look at what a consumer may think of. So a consumer, here's a toe. In the toe we have a ping. Okay, then that message goes up to my brain and I go out. I have pain in my toe. So from a consumer perspective, that's what they may understand. Now, depending on your background and some consumers as well, they might understand that, we have this idea of pain receptors or damage detectors, taking that message of pain signal up to the spinal cord relay, and that then took it up to our brain and the same result. So it's a little bit more involved than the original consumer idea. So with that, let's challenge that idea. So, think a little bit about this one. Might take a little bit of effort, but let's challenge that idea. There's 2 ways we're going to do it. First one's just a self-reflective exercise. Just have a think for me. Have a think. Have you ever had a cut, a bruise, or a scratch, and you had no idea it was there until you saw it? Okay, think about that. Cut, a bruise, or a scratch, and you look down and go, Where did that come from? And then you rack your brain about what you cut yourself on or bruised your leg on. It's quite common. So we know that, you know, that process of nociception occurred as soon as we had that tissue injury, but those messages still went to the brain, but relative to what's going on, it went, this is not important until the data changes. So that's one way of challenging it. Let's think of another way, and you can do this with me. Please do this on a finger that doesn't have an injury at the moment. Is all I want you to do is just stretch your finger backwards until you feel stretch. Now, if I keep going at a nice slow pace, eventually it will actually start to hurt. Once it hurts, let it go. Give it a shake. Now, it actually hurt, but did I do any tissue damage? So when we start to look at the ideas of pain, it's just a lot more complex than what we used to have the simplistic view of. So that was experiencing pain with no damage, and the previous one, the self-reflective exercises, having some form of tissue damage and having no experience of pain. So it's very, very different. It's much more complex. So when we look at this old view, it can't really explain very well what we just went through. However, if we look at a more modern view, it's a little bit more complex. Okay? And that's still a simplification of what's going on. We have all different areas from, you know, we have receptors, inflammation, we have the context of the movement, our previous experience, our beliefs, even our gut health, our heart health, everything will be involved because we're a system. So it's a little bit more complex. And all this complexity, it's wonderful complexity, can be summarized simply as a protectometer. It's a nice, simple way of looking at it. And I'm going to just morph that into a slightly different version of the protectometer because I actually use this as a bit more animated. And below that level, and you can see the feelings of pain, you still have other protectors kicking in. Things like your hormone systems, your immune systems, even your muscles, as we nickname it, the splint and sprint systems. They're all still kicking in before you even feel them. And then, for whatever reason, it may elevate. And we may then need to protect that area a little bit more consciously. And pain is that lovely conscious protector. So here's a little bit of a contrived example. I want you to try and predict what's going to happen. So we have two energy sources, both thermal, so both heat. Let's just say they're exactly outputting the exact same amount of heat. So therefore, the insult to the tissue would be the same. The effect at the tissue level will be the same. I want you to try and predict what would typically happen. And if we click the little hands, we'll see what typically would happen. Because the context, we've had previous experiences, we're programmed, we're even taught from a very young age that flames are dangerous, it's red, it's hot. Whereas the other one may not seem as threatening to us, even though it may be emitting the same amount of thermal energy that could potentially damage tissue. So that's one little contrived idea. A great summary of that is this idea, where we may have an event that's the same. So here we'll build this with you. So on the side here, we've got the pain scale, 0 to 10, classic pain scale. On the bottom, the horizontal axis, we've got no injury through a tiny injury through to a full-on catastrophic injury. And you can see there's 3 dots, and they're in the no injury category line. So they're in that little space where there's no injury. And the event's the same. And what it is like a device. And this is just a way of explaining. So it's a contrived example where we just sort of squeeze onto your finger and you could just, sort of crank on it and then elicit the same amount of pressure. So same amount of, pounds per square inch or whatever, which way you want to say it. And we have 3 different variables. And those variables are a friend is in control of the device, a stranger who you have no idea who they are is in control of the device, and yourself. So I want you to predict which dot, which is the white dot, which is the yellow dot, and which is the top dot. And hopefully you came up with that idea. So even though the insult to the tissue would be the same, the response is different. There's still no injury involved, but the experience may be very, very different. And this is just another contrived example or a way of explaining how it may actually involve a few more things. So here's another great analogy. So again, from the guys from Neugroup, so Moseley and Butler. And this is a thing we call the Twin Peaks model. I've got a little animation. So if you can imagine, hopefully you can see my cursor. If I'm walking up the mountain, it takes a fair bit of effort. Now, under normal circumstances, and this is that idea we just experienced before with our finger stretch idea, is we'll get to an area where we'll actually start to experience something before we get to the level where the tissues will actually start to fail. So under normal circumstances, we should experience pain, and it actually stops us from going to the point where our tissues will start to break down. That's how it protects us. So we have this buffer zone. Okay, a buffer zone. So that's one way, or the first half of that. It protects us by we experience something before we get there. Okay. So the old view of the pain is all about detection of damage is not really accurate. Whereas the modern view that it's about protection from damage is a little bit more accurate when it comes to these sorts of experiences. So, and it does this because it's constantly weighing up the risk, constantly judging what's going on all the time. So again, that old view that pain detects as tissue damage, we're moving on to this pain protects us, which we've already covered, but now promotes healing. So how, though? How does pain promote healing? So pain can promote healing if we go back to the Twin Peaks idea that, say, for example, we do injure ourselves. So under normal circumstances, we'd experience pain before we have the buffer zone and we back off before we hurt ourselves. But if we rapidly go past that barrier to above the red line, or we sneak past the protect by pain barrier and get to the red line, then our tissues may start to fail and we'll have an injury. Okay? So if we have an injury, then how does pain actually promote healing? Well, what it does is when the tissue tolerance drops because we've injured the tissue, our protect by pain barrier also drops, increasing that buffer zone. And that buffer zone has expanded rapidly because of all those lovely inflammatory chemicals sensitizing, nociceptors and spinal pathways and everything. So it's rapidly expanded that buffer. And why does it do that? Well, simple. We offload the tissues. We allow them to heal. So it's a really, really, really key component that, especially in that acute phase of pain, that yes, pain is doing its job really, really well. It's expanding it, it's responding, it's doing it. You're going to offload those tissues and those tissues can heal, which is cool. So here's a little video to explain that.
Let's imagine the relationship between pain and tissue damage as like a cliff. You only injure your tissues when you go over the edge. And in normal circumstances, pain is like the protective barrier that stops you from getting too close. You can still enjoy the view, but pain keeps you safe. When we injure ourselves, it's usually because we've rapidly pushed past the barrier or snuck past it over time. Inflamed tissues then cause nearby senses to become sensitive in order to protect us. This is like the barrier moving away from the cliff's edge. So you can't even get close enough to the edge where you might cause damage. The increased protection allows and promotes healing because it stops the tissues from being stressed. Normally, inflammation resolves and the barrier takes its normal place. And we can enjoy the view once more.
Cool. So that's horizontal version of the Twin Peaks, and I created that with Lorimer Moseley and also Dan Harvey's actually the narrator, and they're all researchers over in Adelaide, and it sort of explains it. And that's actually a resource that we're now putting out there on the PainRev website, so you can start to also use those ideas to engage some of your patients as well. So if you want more information, I'll send it through to Jade. Okay, so that's essential pain fact 1. And as you can see, the pain in that acute sense really does protect us from doing injuries. But if we do have an injury, it really does promote healing by rapidly expanding that buffer. So we're going to move on to persistent. So essential pain fact 2, which is persistent pain overprotects us and prevents recovery. Where our system's becoming sensitive. So again, that old idea or the old view that persistent pain signals an unresolved injury. Now we know that there's different inflammatory markers. Yep, acknowledge all that sort of stuff. But the research has shown that a lot of the tissues do heal quite well, and they need that last little bit by getting involved in movement and stuff. Whereas the modern view of it is persistent pain is that overprotects us and prevents recovery. So again, same idea. Think about, have you heard of neuroplasticity? So neuroplasticity is that great idea that it's the ability for the brain and the nervous system to change. And we know there's heaps and heaps of ways to do it, from voltage changes to dendritic arbor to inserting more sensors, and it's incredible. But as science has increased, we now know that there's a lot more involved. And so we're starting to broaden that idea to bioplasticity. So have a think, what is bioplasticity? Well, it's the ability for all cells and tissues to change. And, from the brain, the nerves, the immune cells, right through. And those immune cells are really important because, as we now know through even more research, all those glial cells that, that's why I got its name GLUE, we now used to think they did nothing, but now we know they do an awful lot, especially when it comes to the nervous system and especially when it comes to things like pain. So this idea of bioplasticity, it's because we actually can't stop changing. It's happening all the time. And if you start to think about different ideas, that we're always changing. So here's a little question for you. When have you noticed yourself change? It might be things like learning to drive or ride a bike or read or spell, or, how many things do we have to keep studying to even remain in this area? We're constantly learning new information. That's all forms of, bioplasticity, neuroplasticity, all those things changing. But even there's more examples. So I want you to just think about different examples. Now I want you to think of a patient and what's actually happening to your patient's pain problem since it started. Think of a persistent pain case. So I'm going to get you to do this in 2 little areas. One, come up with a couple of ideas of how, or bioplasticity. So different examples might be, getting big muscles or something like that. But also want you to think about a patient and then someone you've known for a while and see how their pain experience is changing. Okay, just think of those ideas. So I'll give you 1 minute. Just a little idea, just 1 minute. Okay, off we go. There we go, 1 minute. So, hope you started to explore some of those ideas. So, all these things are forms of bioplasticity. So there are heaps of examples of bioplasticity. So learning a new skill is an example, and getting weaker with bed rest, which we've all seen that. Becoming stiffer as you do less. Okay, bones changing shape, they're all forms of, bioplasticity. Developing habits, good or bad. Even developing immunity to a virus, which is kind of topical. And this is an interesting one, learning how to go on a date again, especially after the last couple of years. Worrying more easily is another form of bioplasticity. Developing a callus and even getting fitter. Okay, so we've all seen different forms of bioplasticity. So hopefully you came up with one of those, or many of those, or different ones to those. But there's other examples of bioplasticity too. And in the world of pain, developing a pain system hypersensitivity is one of those. And reducing pain system hypersensitivity is another one as well. So it's where our neuro and our immune systems and all our surrounding associated tissues are actually going to start to change. So bioplasticity and how we can change can predict it. So we used to say things.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? It's Jay from the PHN. Sorry, we can't see you. Do you want to just, I know it's a glitch going on with Teams at the moment. Do you want to just turn your camera, switch it on and off, and we might be able to see. Oh, you can see him again. Fantastic. I can see him now. I can't on my end. Great. Yeah. Thanks, Grant. Sorry.
That's cool.
Keep going.
Yeah. It's all right. It's just Teams. All right. So we used to say things like pain is unavoidable, but suffering is optional. Okay. But we now say, because of all this research into how we change, is that pain changes from moments, seconds, minutes, weeks, months, and even years. It's constantly changing. We used to say, and it's all predicted because of what happens with bioplasticity. So we used to say things like change is possible. We actually now say change is inevitable. But how we change is not. So we may need to drive which direction we want to go. So, and it's all due to bioplasticity. So let's think about that last one. Change is inevitable, but how we change is not. It's really important, because the funny thing is that when people become engrossed in persistent pain, encapsulated in persistent or shackled by persistent pain, we do less, but we know that physiologically we need people to move to even finish off those last parts of remodeling and stuff like that. So we need to get them re-engaged. But we also know that it will change the system as well. So it's one of those key statements that's really coming out now in lots of research and educational platforms. So if we go back to this idea here, we had the superhuman effort. Through here, we had the buffer zone. We then had the injury. It all drops down. We had the bigger buffer zone. It expanded, all because of the inflammation. But what happens over time is that inflammation does settle, and then where some people, normally it all goes back up, but some people it stays enlarged. And that's pretty much because the system is learning to protect that area very, very well, from a peripheral nervous spinal up to the brain and back down through the descending pathways. It's actually learning how to protect that area really well. So we have an expanded buffer. And as we know, tissues can continue to heal because that's that lovely physiological process, but it's amazing, even when the tissues are doing quite well, that people can still experience pain. And then down the track, it sort of kind of makes, well, not logical sense, but it's more of a intuitive decision where we go, well, if it feels the same, then obviously the injury is still there. And this is where it sets up that idea that, well, obviously there's something still wrong in the tissues, or it's all about the tissues and not actually about our system has learned to protect it well. So we can understand how patients, feel this way, but we need to change the focus about let's retrain this system. That expanded buffer, let's get it back to the way it was before. So here's another video that I did with the Pain Rev, and Daniel has also narrated for us. And it's that same idea we just saw, but it's actually the Cliff version again. So again, another resource that you can use with your patients at some stage if you want to. Hopefully you can hear it this time.
Let's imagine the relationship between pain and tissue damage as like a cliff. You only injure your tissues when you go over the cliff. And in normal circumstances, pain is like a protective barrier that stops you getting too close. You can still enjoy the view, but pain keeps you safe. Now imagine this protective system becomes overprotective, pushing you further from the edge. Now you're really safe, but you can no longer see or enjoy the view. This is what happens with persistent pain. Our pain systems can become overprotective. It hurts, but not because you're over the edge. It's because your system is protecting you too well. But the good news, just as your pain system can learn to be overprotective, it can learn to be less protective, back to a more reasonable level of protection. Through understanding how pain works, we can re-engage in movement and activities and life. We can be unshackled from pain and enjoy the view once again.
Yeah, so it's just another resource, but the whole idea explains that same idea that we've had this expanded buffer and we need people to re-engage, because that's actually how we also teach the buffer to come back. We need to understand we're retraining our system, not just focusing on the tissues. Yes, we need to, that's a bottom-up approach, but it has all this groovy stuff that happens that actually helps our system understand that we can again. And if we do experience pain, which we'll get to in a second, then we need to also be not as worried about it. Okay. So remember from before, we had that idea of bioplasticity, and you've thought about a patient as well. And the system may be going down one pathway, and we need to possibly bring them back. So that learning or riding a bike idea, so we all know that it's all about bioplasticity. So what does it really, really mean to you as a practitioner and working with people? We've got to come up with ways of actually engaging and teaching people how to get back involved, how to get moving, how to actually to re-engage in everything, including life. So we can't stop changing, and we have this magnificent system, okay? And the thing that we've got to be aware of is it's a much more complex system than what we previously thought. And as I said, this is still a simplification. And if you look at this system overall, it's quite overwhelming. But you've got to remember, we could learn in different areas where, different, processes or things like the thalamus, they all learn. And then we have different areas where we might not learn over here, or up in this area where we change how our previous experience or how we understand our previous experiences, or the language in which we use. And that's a really big one for therapists out there. We've got to change how we talk about it. And even, things like the context of the thing, or even the belief systems. But pretty much all those areas of this amazing system are where the system learns to become protective of that area. They all adapt. So we need to actually change. So if we have, and that's a good segue into this, so many factors influence pain. And that same idea, the old idea, tissues cause the pain. That was what we used to think and understand or believe. And we now know through lots of really good research that it's not the case. But the many factors influence pain. So remember that idea before. Go back to that idea where we were thinking this contrived example, or a good summary example, if you will, where you had no injury involved, but we have a device where you could squeeze the finger and you had 3 different variables. The insult to the tissue is exactly the same. The experience is very different just simply because of the context. Some of you have no idea. And it'll be interesting to actually then, what the stranger is. I mean, if they come in big and strong and tough, scary looking, or not, whether or not that will also change the experience too. And this idea before, again, thermally the exact same insult to the tissue, but 2 different ideas. So it's a little bit more complex. Now think about that patient again. When has something unusual influenced the patient's pain? And we all know, we've all done it ourselves. Even when I've been sick or ill or injured, you can talk to that person that just makes your life feel fantastic, and things just decrease a little. It might drift off into the background. Or you talk to an energy vampire and things just become a little bit in the foreground. So it's something we've got to be aware of, that there are influences, many influences on pain. So you might want to jot this stuff down. That's the little right symbol. So, that's right. It's hard to do this without my other computer because Teams doesn't let me share things differently. So we've got this idea, context, if you will. I want you just to simply get a pen, write it down, and write down the word pain, which you've already seen me write. So write down the word pain. Okay. Now, if you did that, you probably just wrote down pain, P-A-I-N. And that's understandable because we're here talking about persisting pain and the essential pain facts. However, did anyone write down P-A-Y-N? P-A-Y-N. I actually know, professor of exercise physiology, Professor Warren Payne. That's why I'd write that down. Or if you're a glacier, you may write down the word pain very differently because it's about context. So when it comes to the idea of context, there are actually experiments with it. And here's another idea of context. So if we look at this, we've all seen these things on the internet and stuff like that. So it's just a picture. So because of your previous experiences and knowledge and the fact that you grew up in a one sun world, so you know where the sun's coming from, and because of the way the shadow's working, you've seen horizon lines before. Because of all of those things in your system, your brain creates a picture because the eyes collect the light, but the brain has to make sense of it. If I then take a section out of that to the side, from each area, you'll actually see that the two sections of grey are actually the same grey. But if you look at it generally, the top block is darker, the bottom block is lighter, one is white, one is grey, even though the greys are exactly the same. Now, it's not a PowerPoint trick because if you want to, you can put your finger across your screen and you'll actually see that it's actually there. So it's a great example of previous context actually influencing vision. Okay, an illusion, if you will. But it's about perception and context. So there are actually experiments in this, and the experiments have been done, and there's more than just this one. This is just to highlight the fact. This particular experiment done by Lorimer Moseley over in Adelaide as well is a bit of a classic experiment in this idea of context. So in this experiment, they had a thermode that they placed on the back of the hand. It was a cold thermode, and it was placed with the exact same amount of pressure in the exact same location, and it was about -20 to 21 degrees Celsius. So it's quite cold, and to be truthful, if you put -21 degrees on the back of the hand, you probably burn yourself. They couldn't see what was going on. Same pressure, same insult to the tissue, and what happened was the only other extra data that came up was either a red light or a blue light. And when there was a red light, when they placed the thermode on the back of the hand, the person reported it being hot. Not just hot, but painfully hot. And when there was a blue light, it was cold. Okay. So everyone except for one person. So I'll just premise that. So everyone in the experiment except for one person had that experience. Now, the only different data was vision. Okay, and there are more experiments. There's even stuff in the British Medical Journal about a guy standing on a nail that all highlight this idea that we have more involved in our pain systems than just simply what's going on in the tissues. So anything that suggests that we may need protecting takes our pain up. So if we look at that again, it could be things like poor sleep, deconditioned bodies, excessive loads, tissue irritations or inflammations, an old understanding of pain, that pain is all about tissue. Work is too hard or too onerous, negative predictions, if I do that, it's going to hurt. Or even things like poor nutrition, changing our gut health, may all lead to negative changes in our system. So all these different points that the system can learn can be contributors to the pain or our experience of pain. Okay. So another way to think of it is this. Here's a horizontal amplifier, if you will. On one side we have safety, the other side we have danger. There's our little protectometer, and it's already on the edge of the point where we'll start to feel some or experience some pain. And if we have things that start to increase our dangers, even how we believe, think, our behaviours, our general health, past experiences, even how people talk about it will start to influence our system. These are broad categories. It's taking our system, our pain protective system up. And that leads in very, very nicely to essential pain fact number 4. Because if there are many, many ways that, or many, many factors that influence pain, there are many, many ways then we can reduce pain and gradually recover. So again, that classic slide. We used to think things like to fix persistent pain, you aim solely or mainly at the tissues that hurt. We've got to keep targeting those, keep targeting those, keep targeting those. And we're not saying they're not an influence, don't get me wrong. We need to potentially do stuff there, exercise, etc. But if we solely do that, then we're going to miss the boat. And as we said before, there are many, many ways that we can then reduce pain. So if there's many ways that influence, or many things that influence it, we've got many ways that we can reduce it and retrain your system more towards normal. Or probably a better way to say that is to many ways to reduce pain and recover. Okay. So all these points that we saw before on this, more complex system as we saw, they can contribute to pain, but they're also potential areas that we can also change how the system works. We can teach our system to learn how to be less protective, more normal protective. Or again, this classic slide, in teaching we tend to repeat things a lot, but it's that classic slide. If it suggests it takes pain up, but anything that suggests you don't need as much protecting will take it down. So before, again, we had the poor sleep, deconditioned body, excessive load, tissue irritations, old understanding of pain. That tissues all, it's all about the tissues. Work is too hard, negative predictions, poor nutrition will elevate our system and we'll get those protections. But if we actually have good sleep, if we restore movement, have appropriate loads to try and address those tissues, recondition our body, reduce tissue irritations, inflammations and stuff. And exercise does that well. Even some early research into certain, different breathing techniques and stuff is starting to show promise there too. A modern understanding of pain. Okay? The pain is about, persisting pain especially, is about a protective system that's become hypersensitive. Work is supportive, positive predictions. This can change. It will get better. It's not dangerous to my tissues. Good nutrition will lead to more positive changes. So again, if you look at this idea, the protectometer is right up there. And if we can reduce some of those dangers, we'll start to see it come back down. If we can also increase some safeties, we may get it to a point where they're actually quite comfortable. So how do we know your patients can change? Well, we established it before. We can't stop changing. It is inevitable. So if we can steer them in the right direction due to that lovely, lovely idea, say it with me, bioplasticity, we'll actually be able to get them to change, get their protective systems to change. So our pain system hypersensitivity, it's learned to be very good at protecting you, protecting that area. We can actually train it to be more normalized, more less protective, or a normal buffer again. So this is a classic Goldilocks principle, and this is used a lot in things like, well, originally in things like neuroplastic research, and more so now in the bioplastic stuff as well. And we've all seen the reverse U idea. And so we have this idea that we have not enough, okay, we're not going to get enough change. If we have too much, we may have flare-ups in our pain and therefore potentially increase the buffer. So we've got to not be afraid of feeling things as well, but not get it to the point where the flare-ups are so bad that we don't get anywhere. But if we can get things just right, we get those positive changes. The good old Goldilocks principle. But what we've got to understand, especially therapists like myself, is we've got to understand that people's Goldilocks is, or the just right component might be small, and it might be minuscule as well. One of our absolute classic pain rev champions, who's a recovered person from persistent pain, she had to start her Goldilocks just right part was so small that she started with graded motor imagery, just being able to picture doing movements. And now she's actually doing very, very well. Absolute champion when it comes to persistent pain. So this is one of the big principles that we use to train the body and the brain to actually change. So, but recovery from persistent pain does start with understanding it. Understanding that it's actually not hopeless. It's actually predictable that we can get better if we start doing the right things. Start thinking about it differently, talking about it differently, and certainly re-engaging. Don't get me wrong, understanding it can be quite difficult. Okay. So if we go back to this idea where we had the buffer, we've had the injury, and now we've got the expanded, the expanded inflammation once that's the acute phase. Then we get the tissues, the pain hypersensitivity. So it's the tissues are healing quite well. They're well down the track. It's 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 2 years, 20 years down the track. Tissues will still be influencing it, but the influence may be a lot smaller. Other things may be influencing it. Look at that whole big system. And as the tissues do heal, as I said, if we still have that expanded buffer, we're still experiencing pain at a low level of activity, but we need to encourage people to move towards and work with it. So over time, though, if we do it well, we should be able to come back to a far more normalized buffer. And that's what we're aiming at with everyone. And bioplasticity and all those sciences that are really underpinning it actually predict this. So here's a classic little picture. Let's get a quick squeeze on time because I don't have a clock up there. Almost there. So here's a classic little picture from the NOI group again. And seriously, great thanks to the NOI group for allowing us to use these sort of pictures. So most people, if you look over at the far left, there's a guy standing there looking up, and there's in his mind, this should be a straightforward journey, a linear progression. Realistically, though, you might take big steps, small steps, go up, go down, but eventually we'll get towards those goals. And if people go in, especially in a persistent pain world, if people go in with an idea that it may be up and down, but we will get there eventually, and things like bioplasticity do predict recovery, then we're actually going to get them well and truly along the way. So you may want to write this little stuff down. So here's a simple one. How do we go about this? Well, the first thing is to probably re-engage these people. One of the best ways is to start to learn that modern view of pain. Re-engage them, get them to understand that it's actually not a dead-end street, that it's not just about, this is your lot in life, that you can change this, but we have to approach it differently. We could lower inflammation and everyone will go, yep, let's use some. No. Believe it or not, exercise, meaningful movements actually work, okay? Because as we know, physiologically, we start exercising, we can increase things like interleukin 10, cytokines, interleukin 4, cytokines. We can actually convert how interleukin 6 works within muscles, and it goes from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory within the muscle. So we've got this research out there. So if we start to explain this to people, we can encourage them back into exercise. Exercise isn't just simply about changing someone's biomechanics or muscles. It's actually about all the other cool, groovy stuff that happens behind it. And, of course, then we've got good nutrition. We know there's pro-inflammatory foods and anti-inflammatory foods. If we have a diet that's high in sugars and processed stuff, we know that's not going to assist, okay? So we know all this. We need to create a package around people. Sleep. There's thousands of studies coming out on sleep relative to persistent pain. Lots of groovy stuff happens in our central nervous system when we are asleep, and we need to get good sleep. We can promote appropriate loading. We know that whole idea of bringing buffers back. We've got to challenge our system. Yes, adapt those tissues, those those components, but it also proves to our central systems that we can do this stuff. We can change. We can do more. And that's really important. And so quite often we won't talk about exercise. We'll talk more in terms of meaningful movements, get them back into activity. Quite often when you talk about creating fit for purpose people, get back into that particular role. And of course, language. And that's one of the big things, how we have to change as practitioners to move forward. So quite often we spend a lot of time in clinical practice these days actually talking and changing how people actually talk about it themselves, but also how other practitioners talk about it. A lot of the things that we used to think aren't as dangerous as what we used to know. I mean, there's studies with, like 3,110 people in 2016. I think the primary author was Bajinki, that showed that changes in discogenic stuff in the lower back is very normal. In fact, you've got about a 75% chance if you're over the age of 50 of having an asymptomatic discogenic, what we'd normally say radiographically, some sort of injury, disease or whatever else. But these people have never had a pain experience in their back. So it's normal. So we actually start to talk differently about it. We're not flippant about what we say, but at the same time, we have to be a little bit less threatening about how we talk about stuff. So if we do that, we can move from this whole idea towards this idea of pain freedom, being unshackled from pain. And that's really important because it's the big step along the way. Because if we can get people to this stage, at least, they're re-engaging, they're doing what they want to do, they're involved in activity again. Big step along the way. They may still be experiencing pain, but they're doing, and it's not stopping them doing what they want. And if we can get them to there, there's no reason why long-term we can't head them towards pain-free. The run home, here we go. So, some take-home messages. And I want you to say it with me out loud. I know I can't hear you, but just say it out loud. The first one, which was the original number one thing in the 9 points, all pain is real. It's an experience, the person is experiential, it's real. However, it usually promotes healing. Usually it's about promoting healing, protecting us and promoting healing. Persistent pain protects us, overprotects us, and prevents recovery. Okay? Again, I want you to say it with me. All pain is real, but many factors influence pain. But the cool thing, if many factors influence pain, then we have many ways actually to reduce pain and gradually recover. In fact, recovery is on the cards all the time. Bioplasticity predicts it. So learning that modern view of pain helps people re-engage in activity. They understand that when they experience pain, it's not just simply about the tissues, I'm doing more damage. No, you're experiencing more pain, but we can work with this. We can move. Let's get back into it. How do we get those tissues to get that final stage done? We need to move them. We need to load them. We need to do it appropriately. But I experience more pain. It's okay. Let's talk about it. Understand it. De-threaten it. Or the essential pain facts. Cool. So what now? Call to action for everyone. Start a conversation with your patients, your persistent pain patients. Okay? Time. Remind them. It will actually take them. It's a journey. It's not a quick sprint. Okay? Like the picture of the steps. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. But eventually we can get there. Ask for help from your local pain educator or your collective, or we're now going to rename, hopefully, pain circles. We'll see how that all comes out. And in Western Victoria, there are pain educators all through Western Victoria. Okay, and if you don't know who they are, please contact either myself or contact the Pain Rev directly, and they will let you know who your local pain educator in your area is. Okay, re-engage. Okay, re-engage people, get them back into, encourage activity, get them back into life. Okay, and get them to take control. Because as we know, especially in this world of persistent pain, that self-efficacious behaviours have been demonstrated to be the best step forward. Or just start. So, just to be aware of upcoming events, the local pain collectives, they're happening right now, okay? The other things you've got to be aware, there's going to be big public events coming up, okay? So I'll go back to that one, sorry. So there's going to be public events coming up in your area as well. I'm running one on the 12th of October for a large group of consumers. So if you want to tackle this, the local pain educators in your area will actually be setting up these things for the public as well. So you can actually send some people that you want to encourage this way along to those events so they can get sort of a jump start into it. And then they may come back to you and have a better conversation. And if you'd honestly like to know more about that, please contact the Pain Rev. Okay, we'll get you in touch with your local pain educator in your area, because together, honestly, together, we can make a difference. And that's where it's got to come. We've got to all come together and make a difference in this area. So thank you. Cool. One last little thing, go on to the next slide. Thanks very much for your attendance in general. I'd also like to make a special thanks, which was just about to come up, to the education team, especially because I am part of it, but guys like Abby, Margaret, Diane, Daniel, Kylie and Tanushka, they've helped me create all this sort of stuff. And also the hierarchy at there. And as you can see, it's actually a big group. This is just one picture they did from one of their rides in Victoria, but it's a collective. And as I said, together, with yourself, with Pain Rev, with other groups as well, local health, healthcare professionals, we can make a difference in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. That was a fantastic talk. I don't have any questions at this stage. If anybody has got any questions, we've got a couple of minutes, so type them in that question and answer box and I can ask them on your behalf. You won't be identified. And I'm sure if anyone thinks of anything that they want to ask or anything after this, just contact me, or I can get you in touch with Grant and we can go from there. But can I just take this opportunity, Grant, to thank you so much. That was excellent. Such a great talk. And could I let the attendees thank you for attending, everyone. And please, the evaluation link is in the chat. So if you could take the time to fill that out, we would love your feedback, suggestions, or anything like that on the talk. I will pass them on to Grant and get your feedback.
Yep. One last thing too, if no one has any questions, your local pain collective will go into those particular essential pain facts and explore them further with you, and also they can also show you how they become more clinically relevant as well. That's the whole idea of these sort of collectives and getting people sort of networking and talking to everyone about how the modern story of pain actually can change or predicts change. So, which is cool. So if you want to delve into it further, talk to them. They're there to help. That's why they're there.
Excellent. Okay, well, we will end this webinar for all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Grant, for attending, and we will keep everyone up to date with what is happening with the Pain Revolution.
Yep.
Bye, everyone. See you next time.